I would like to introduce today as our next speaker for the Global Food System Seed Grant Program, Dr. Vaishali Sharda. She's assistant professor in biological and agricultural engineering in the College of Engineering here at Kansas State University. And Dr. Sharda worked closely with Dr. Katherine Nelson, who is an assistant professor of geography in the College of Arts and Sciences. Dr. Sharda?
Thank you for your introduction, Maureen. This has been a very exciting project, and I'm happy to share some of the progress that we've made. So the project title is Quantifying Agricultural and Social Vulnerability to Climate Change in the Eastern Kansas River Basin to inform decision making. So this the seed project was funded by Global Food Systems, and I worked, like Maureen mentioned, I worked closely with Dr. Nelson over the period of last 2.5 years, with some of our graduate students also working in this project. So I'm going to briefly outline the motivation behind the project that made us come up with this idea, some specific objectives that we defined, the methods that we used, and some of the results and the conclusions, as well as the products of this project. So as most of us are aware, that there has been an increase in frequency of extreme events in the past few years, and with climate change, if we consider climate change projections, both floods and droughts are predicted to become more common in the future climate scenarios. So what you see on this slide on the top is the US drought monitor from today. And if you pay attention to Kansas, you can see a lot of those oranges and browns, which indicate different stages of drought that we are in. And on the bottom is a flooding picture from last summer in the Kansas City area. So Northeast Kansas specifically is very prone to floods as well as droughts. So that was the basic idea driving this project, because these extreme climatic events increase pressure upon livelihoods, and agricultural sector specifically is more prone to some of these extreme events. And we believe that assessment of vulnerability to climate change can provide direction and backing for adaptation planning and decision-making processes. There have been some studies in the past that evaluate agricultural vulnerability at local level. However, approaches to integrate our crop production systems, our food production systems, to social aspects under future climate scenarios remain to be seen. So we saw a need for development of a methodology to assess this vulnerability of our crop production and social systems that is sensitive to local realities, but at the same time that can be adapted to a bigger spatial extent. So this was the basic motivation behind this project, which made us undertake this study with two specific objectives. So the two objectives that we defined were to first spatially analyze and model the system to assess and map the cropping systems in general in the region, and the vulnerability of our social systems to extreme future events. And secondly, once we have that framework to develop a robust and replicable climate vulnerability index that we call CVI, that is specific to the region, and yet it's general enough that it can be applied to other parts of the state and nation to spatially map our agricultural and socioeconomic vulnerability. So keeping this in mind, we define climate vulnerability index as a function of three main variables: sensitivity, exposure, and adaptive capacity. So exposure in this case is the magnitude and frequency of extreme events. So we looked at the historic and current data, and we also look at the future climate projections and how the changes in temperature and precipitation would lead to, would alter the frequency of extreme events. This feeds into the sensitivity of the system, which is defined as that the system can be either positively or negatively affected by the changes in the climate. And we use the crop production system as the sensitivity component of the climate vulnerability index. Which then feeds into the adaptive capacity, which is defined as the capability of a society in general to adapt to the changes. And it depends on the demographic and economic characteristics of the population. And this all feeds into the climate vulnerability index, which again, of course, the driver remains the climate, but the crop production as well as the socioeconomic structure feeds into it. So I would talk about sensitivity and adaptive capacity separately. I worked more on sensitivity, and Dr. Nelson was in charge of the adaptive capacity component. So first, touching upon sensitivity component of this project. So what you see on your right studies or the study area. So we define it as Eastern Kansas River Basin. There are about 17 counties in this region. We chose this region because it's predominantly rain-fed agriculture, so not as much irrigation as you would find in some other parts of the state. So it's more vulnerable as far as it comes to extreme climatic events. So we looked at some of the data sources that we looked at to come up with the sensitivity component or the crop suitability component of this project were of historic observed yield from 1990 to 2019. We collected, downloaded Surgo data, which is a NRCS database of soils at a very fine spatial scale. We downloaded it for the region along with climate data. So for historic data, we use GridMet, which is University of Idaho's gridded surface meteorological data set. And for future climate data, we used a suite of 18 global climate models. Data was downscaled using statistical downscaling techniques and produced data for until 2099 and two different RCP scenarios, RCP scenario 4.5 and 8.5 were used. So the RCP scenarios define the carbon dioxide concentration in the future and what it would look like. So the Surgo data, the soils data, the climate data, along with the crop management data was fed into a crop model that we use in our research group called DSAT. So what you see here is a little bit of a framework for DSAT. So present data or historic data went into the model, soils data and crop management data that was collected using information from KSRE. And I'm specifically talking about corn or maize as of now. And the model was calibrated where the genetic coefficients of corn are adjusted to match the simulated yield with the historic observed yield that we had from NAS. So once we were satisfied with the performance of the model over historic data, we felt confident enough to use that model with the future data to forecast yield and yield components. So some of the calibration results, so we set up the model for all 17 counties, but the table right here is showing some selected counties from the region or from EKSRB. So the columns show the observed yield and the simulated yields and some statistics, including root mean square error and d-stat. So closer the d-stat to 1, the higher confidence you have in your model. The model performed pretty well for all of the counties, and we were satisfied with the calibration procedure. One thing that we noticed when looking at these counties is that the soils in the region are very variable and have a great impact on the yield in addition to climate. So spatial soil variability became another driving factor in our yield simulations. So what the table right here is basically showing you the historic. The first column shows the historic yields from 1990 to 2019 for different types of soils. And then one example of a few percentage change, yield change in the future. So we have divided the century into 3 parts. We call it near century, mid-century, and late century. So 2010 to 2039, 2040 to 2069, and 2070 to 2099. So this makes it easier for us to split the data into different parts and then analyze it to plan for some of the adaptation strategies in the future. So what you see here, generally, most of the soils in most of the counties for the region, the predicted yield is lower than the present yield. So what it is showing is that basically with the precipitation going down, temperatures rising, and extreme events becoming more common, we would expect the yield of corn to go down in all the counties, but specifically for some types of soils than the others. Only one soil averaged over all counties performed better in the future for near century and mid-century than the other counties. The figure in this slide is basically showing the 2 scenarios, RCP 4.5 and 8.5, and yield averaged over all counties, over all soils, for the ensemble of the 18 downscale models that we used. And a clear indicator is that irrespective of the RCP scenario, the yields, though variable, are generally decreasing as the century progresses. So once this part of setting up the model and projecting future yield was completed, we wanted to look at the sensitivity. So where does that come in? That comes in the form of crop suitability. That what is the suitability of growing a crop in the future given the changes in the climate. So we created or developed suitability maps using this formula that we obtained from a study published. So reference yield is equal to mean yield plus minus 2 standard deviations of the mean yield. So areas with mean yields above the reference yield, where reference yield was mean of historic yield, were classed as or classified as suitable, while the yields below the reference yield, or the areas with reference yield below the reference yield, were deemed unsuitable for farming that particular crop, corn in this case, in the future. So these maps right here show the historic yield on the top left and the future yield of corn in near century, mid-century, and late century, and how suitable a specific region was for growing corn in the future. So you can see the yellows The suitability where the crop yields increased over time are greens, and you would see very low percentage of greens. I wish there was a way to zoom in into these maps, but very small areas that show that the area is better suited for growing corn in the future than it is now. So this is still a work in progress, but we are still working on the other two crops for the region. That would be soybean and winter wheat. So completing the same exercise for the other two crops. We do have the models calibrated for soybean in the region, and Rintu, who is a graduate student on this project, is working on creating crop suitability for soybean for the region. So moving on to the adaptive capacity piece of this project. So this is what Dr. Nelson is working on or has been working on. So like I've already defined adaptive capacity when we first showed you that flow chart of how to calculate the climate vulnerability. But the procedure was that literature was studied on measurement of agricultural and community vulnerability, its resilience, and the adaptive capacity. And some of the measures used in the studies or the review studies were developed into a framework for adaptive capacity for communities that depend on agriculture in the region. The framework developed is shown on the right-hand side of the slide. This framework acknowledges that local physical resources, community, and the social structure and community and farm economics all influence the ability of our agricultural communities to adapt and respond to changes, environmental changes or changing climatic conditions. So Dr. Nelson and one of her students identified 31 unique measures that were obtained from publicly available data sources to construct the adaptive capacity index for the entire state. And then she's going to focus on EKSRB and different multiple normalization and standardization techniques were used, and they found that the sensitivity testing showed that up to 30% change in ACI values were observed over the state. And a subset of 4 out of those 31 unique measures predict that the ACI values with the R-square of 0.78, so highly statistically significant relationship there. They then validated the ACI developed, and after accounting for climate conditions and local context, they found that it is significantly associated with better overall conditions for unemployment, farm income that is not from government subsidies, cash crop receipts, median income, population density, and overall crop yield across corn, soybean, and winter wheat. Projecting ACI into the future, so they take, her model takes in the relationship between future crop yields and other measures, and then it produces ACI for a range of future values. And then it's recalculated and updated. ACI is recalculated and updated. We are still working on several components of this project using other funding sources, because this is very interesting work and we want to ultimately get to the climate vulnerability index. So like I mentioned, we are still working on crop suitability for other crops. We are working on projecting ACI, taking into account those crop suitability projections, and then determine if using factor analysis for construction of ACI results in reduced sensitivity of the index. And this will then all again feed into development of the climate vulnerability index. I do want to point out some of the products which I know is very dear to Global Food Systems Initiative. So we were able to, given the challenges of the pandemic, we were still able to present the findings, some of the findings of the results in several conferences in forms of posters and presentations. The names that you see in purple are the graduate students that have been associated with this project. Recently, I believe it was last week, Rintu, who is one of graduate students in our department, won the poster competition, which was a product of this project. In addition to that, so that this will cover the workforce development as far as the sustainability of this project beyond the funding period of the Global Food System Seed Grant. Is Dr. Nelson and I have been funded together on a USDA grant that would start in May this year. It's a $750,000 grant with KU as the PI is in KU. And we were recently awarded NSF EPSCoR R2 Track 2, a $6 million proposal on which I'm the PI and Dr. Nelson is a co-PI on that project. So again, the relationships that were formed in this project have led to collaborations on other projects as well. And that is all I have for the progress on this project. Please feel free to contact me. My email and contact details are here along with Dr. Nelson's, and I'll be happy to respond to any queries. Thank you.